Welcome to Talking Absolute Worship. We've assembled some of the finest minds of the Southwestern Synod to have a bit of a chat about lectionary readings, how they inspire our preaching, and how they might inspire the other elements of our worship this week. So, Ruth, you've had a chance to read these things. Where are you going this week?
Well, I got a little bit sidetracked, I think, by Psalm 147. Because in there's stuff about thanksgiving. It's good to sing psalms, it's good to give thanks. And then it says, the Lord's pleasure is in those who fear him. And I got myself a bit caught up on fear and remembered that in Rejoice and Sing, at least, when we sing All People That on Earth Do Dwell, we don't sing Him Serve with fear. We sing Him Serve with mirth. And I thought, so what's, and a lot of the Bible, certainly when angels pop up, they tend to say, fear not. So this mustn't be the sort of fear that I think it is. It's got to be another sort of fear. So I started thinking, well, it could mean awe or reverence or honour. That makes some kind of sense. And then I looked at the Isaiah reading. And this is from the second Isaiah, so the end of the exile in Babylon. So it could be a time when people were feeling very fearful, actually. But second Isaiah is full of all this lovely stuff about God lifting people up and sorting them out and giving them strength and so on. And I came across a lovely note which says that the term creator and created are used more by second Isaiah than any other Old Testament writer. Now, I don't know whether that's true because I haven't read the whole of the Old Testament again, just to check. But that's what the note said. And that got me thinking that for second Isaiah, and then I think for the psalmist, there's this thing about our identity comes from our relationship with God. And that when we hold God in reverence, we remember who we are in relation to God. Not that God doesn't love us and therefore we should be afraid, but God loves us, but is also God. I realise that's not very profound, but that's kind of where I was going with this. So God is God, and then who are we? And God is creator, and we are the created. But we are also made in the image of God, so we too are meant to be part of creation, but also part of God's creating. So I think that to put that together is something about identity here for me, because God is God and to be revered. We are God's children, but also somehow co-creators with God. And I thought that then reflects on how we treat God, how we speak of God, how we worship God, how we try to serve God, but also how we treat others, because they too are part of God's creation and God's blessed children, and then how we treat the natural world. I was hearing just today on the radio somebody suggesting that in responding to the coronavirus pandemic, we know that's a crisis and we've all kind of stepped up and done stuff. But with the climate crisis, we somehow still can't get our heads around the idea that it's a crisis. And I think as Christians, we should be saying, God is the creator and has given us responsibility for the creation. And so this crisis really matters. And we should be speaking out very strongly that our identity is to be co-creators with God. And for me, that came out of the Isaiah. And also the note of hope, because when you think about the state of the world, and it can get a bit depressing. So we've got those lovely words that the Lord doesn't grow weary or grow faint, and those who look to the Lord will renew their strength. So God is our strength, as well as being the one who provokes us into caring for creation. So that's my starting point.
I don't think that's a sidetrack. That's very, very, very far from being a sidetrack, Ruth. I think that's the fundamental heart of what's actually going on in this psalm and in the Isaiah reading. I think I probably in different language, but wrestling with the same thing about transcendence and immanence. The thing that really caught my imagination, led me off down a huge rabbit hole, which I think will in fact probably be where I go with preaching this, is the viewpoint of the psalmist and the viewpoint of Isaiah, to a slightly lesser extent, but the same, is this whole idea of the psalmist and Isaiah, Isaiah saying, it is he who sits above the circle of the earth. And it really made me think of the first photograph of Earth from space, the first time we had God's viewpoint of the earth. And I read up a bit about, I might say a bit about that later when we talk about the rest of worship, but the picture I had in my head was of us zooming out from the earth and looking back on ourselves and wrestling with that relationship that you're talking about, but seeing it the other way around, from normally sort of jostling for space and looking around at each other. We're looking in on who we are, and who we are, not just as individuals in a kind of navel gazing way, but who we are as the human race, as God's children. I like your word better though, as relationship with God is a better way of saying that. So thank you for that. And that's pretty much where I started and ended this week, with that picture of, particularly that is Isaiah, because I think that's absolutely spectacular for Isaiah to be saying, he who sits above the circle of the earth. And then all these thousands of years later, for us to actually have those photographs of somebody sitting above the circle of the earth and taking photographs and looking from that view that Isaiah could see back then, is absolutely phenomenal insight for someone to imagine that, or prophetically see it, or have it in a vision, or whatever it was that happened. And the psalmist, to a lesser extent, has the same idea about counting the stars, etc., etc. So yeah, I think there's a lot of meat in that, and I think you've put it slightly more humanly than I did, because I was talking about immanence and transcendence, and I think I might replace those words with God's relationship with humankind. Neil, where did you find yourself heading with these readings?
Yeah, no, I think I'm in a not entirely dissimilar territory to the two of you. I think one of the things that really caught me was the significance of remembering, the importance of remembering things. So it seems to me, yeah, from what I was reading around, that maybe both the Isaiah text and the Psalm relate to the time of exile. The Isaiah, second Isaiah in the midst of it, and then the Psalm perhaps in the aftermath of it and the rebuilding after it. And they both seem to be texts that are speaking about in the midst of times of chaos, in the midst of times when it may seem that actually God has been dethroned. That actually those who live their lives thinking they are God's people have been proved to be wrong, because actually, they've gone into exile, and Jerusalem has been ruined, and the temple has been destroyed, or whatever. They both seem to me to be texts that were speaking about, actually, there are things to remember. And in the midst of even the worst of times, and I guess inevitably, the pandemic again, or the climate crisis swing into view. In the midst of the worst of times, what do we remember about God? And then what we're given in both of them, I think, especially in the Isaiah, is just this amazing, as you say, this amazing kind of pulling back and just taking in what there is to remember of God. But I thought also it might be interesting in a sermon to then connect that, which I guess for me, as I was playing with it in my mind, I realized I began to wonder if one of the dangers was that kind of, okay, well, that's great. Here we are still suffering and struggling, and God is God, and that's wonderful. But actually, there still seems to be a divide. And that took me then to both the Mark and the Corinthians. And the power, it seems to me, in the Mark text is, this awe-inspiring God you know, the God who looks down on the earth, is the God who walks into Simon Peter's house and kneels down at the bedside of the mother-in-law and heals her and brings her life. But he's also then in Christ the one who says, actually, now we've had a really busy time, I need to go away to a quiet place and I need to regroup and recharge, and I need to pray and I need to be still, and then we can get going again. And so I guess for me, it would be a sermon of trying to play. I'm not for a second, I think, trying to kind of put those in opposition to each other. It seems to me those are two sides of the same thing, you know, that we're remembering the God who is this amazing creator and beyond time and space, and the God who is kneeling at the bedside. And I can imagine that there might be ways in which that touches things like the pandemic or the pastoral life. I mean, I'm involved at a stage of ministry where I think I'm doing almost a funeral a week at the moment. So I'm thinking a lot about what does it mean to say God is at the bedside. But you're right, Ruth, you know, there's also then that sense of a climate emergency that some people are, you know, wanting to say to us, this is the biggest crisis the world and creation has ever faced. And we're kind of like, yeah, I'm sure it is, but it's so big. What can we do?
Yeah, the psalmist has a go at making that point that you make, but you make it better than the psalmist, if I'm actually.
No, I think that might be a heresy.
Yeah, he didn't have access to the life of Jesus. So he says that same God who sits outside the circle of the earth and names all the stars feeds the young ravens when they cry. And young ravens are pathetic little tiny scraggy bits in a nest. And that God out there is the one that actually wants to see them fed. Yeah, Ruth.
I'm just going to thank Neil, I think, for that, especially when we talk about climate. It can become big and beyond us and difficult to grab hold of. And yes, going back to the mark, to Jesus being at a one-to-one level, and reminding ourselves that that's the work of the kingdom as well. So it isn't, like, as you say, it isn't either or, and it's the looking at the scale and scaling down to get a grasp of I can do that, and then scaling up to say, you know, there's more to do. It's not just about looking after the person in front of you. So thank you. Yeah, found that helpful.
Yeah.
Listen.
Just a reminder that the slogan that we used to have about looking after the world was think globally, act locally. And in a sense, that's what Jesus does. You know, that's what God manages to do. Think globally and act locally. And maybe remembering that helps us just echo what we're saying, really.
Gerald.
No, I was fascinated with the contrast between this great God and the wonderful descriptions of God in the heavens looking down, and then being able to come as a human and God, both human and God, into situations that we're very familiar with. That contrast is amazing. It really is.
It's I think, as I've said on previous episodes, I love Mark's gospel, but it's quite difficult. I find it anyway quite difficult to preach Mark's gospel because it's in such a rush. I think Mark's gospel isn't served well by chopping it up into small portions. I think you've got to read the whole thing. And when you take one bit out and it says, and immediately they went to, and you've lost the flow and the urgency. And it's sometimes because Mark doesn't spend that much time on the emotions and the actually what is said. Quite doesn't even tell us what is said most of the time. It's mostly about what Jesus did. I I think it's a really useful thing, like you've done there, Neil, to draw to allow Mark to sit alongside the Psalm or Isaiah, and to draw the two together, and to take with Mark's gospel the action of God, God made flesh, revealing who this God is we've been talking about through the ages. And I think it does that really powerfully. So I just really like that image of the same God who sits outside the circle of creation is the same one who walks into Simon's house. And it's just such a lovely image. So I think I'll be going with that. That's really nice. So thank you for that. Gerald, where were you thinking of going with these readings?
Well, like Ruth and Neil, maybe it's because we feel that our hearts need to be lifted during this time of crisis and pandemic. It's Isaiah for me, and the reason is I read it for the as I reflected on preparing for our chat this morning, and it's poetry. It's pure poetry. I was drawn back to school days and English lessons in poetry, and our English teacher trying to drill into us the need for simile, use simile and comparison. And maybe I'm giving away my age here, but songs like John Denver's Annie's song, you fill up my senses like a night in the forest, and just beautiful descriptions trying to compare. And the other fascinating thing about this passage is I can't remember any other passage that begins with 4 questions. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood since the earth was founded? Just like someone saying, standing at the front of the class saying, guys, get this. Don't you get this? I mean, it's fairly obvious. And obviously they didn't. And then he begins to describe what this amazing God is really like. And I also was thinking about John Rutter's version of For the Beauty of the Earth, and the visuals that have been put together for that song, for that hymn, are just incredible, absolutely incredible. So yeah, for me, that's where I would probably spend my time. I mean, it feels like Isaiah is saying you need to stand up and cheer this God. I mean, God is just so amazing. We can't go and watch football games at the moment, but this is something worth cheering about.
It's that certainly comes across from Isaiah, and the poetry of it is, even though we've all read Isaiah 40 before, it never fails to stop me in my tracks and think, Struth, this is just a gem of poetic language, isn't it? And I think, as Ruth reminded us, it's all the more startling that this is addressed to people who are in exile. And I think I read something this week that kind of made sense to me. That the commentator said something like, there are 3 ways that the people in exile could have responded to them being in exile in their relationship with God. They could quite naturally have concluded that the Babylonian gods were simply more powerful than their God, and said, well, okay, we backed the wrong horse, and the Babylonian gods were more powerful after all. Or they could have said that, well, God doesn't exist, clearly. Clearly, we were deluding ourselves all along, so let's just make the best of it. Or what this particular commentator thought they actually did was they concluded that God had forgotten about them. And that's why in a lot of the Psalms, there is that language of, "Oh Lord, why have you forgotten me?" Or Jesus uses one of them from the cross, doesn't he? "Why have you abandoned me? Why have you forsaken me?" And it seems to me that this kind of poetic love language in some ways is ideal for addressing that kind of fear. These people have been forgotten. You can't listen to those words from Isaiah and think you've been forgotten, which maybe whereas Neil's idea about remembering comes in, because I think that really is a strong theme. It struck me maybe a bit of a stretch, but suck it and see. This talk of the eagle, Isaiah talking about the eagle, they shall mount up with wings like eagles, reminded me of what was said to the people at the Exodus when God said, I think it's Exodus 19 verse 4, just off the top of my head. Exodus 19 verse 4 says, I bore you on the wings of an eagle, and it was God's language for describing what happened when he rescued them from Egypt. So I wonder whether this figure of the eagle is a remember, I am like the eagle and I rescued you on my back as an eagle. And maybe this poetic reference to the eagle bearing them away again, or them even bearing themselves away as eagles, is a nudge to say, remember what happened. Remember your story. Neil, you were going to chip in.
Yes, no, I think, Gerald, that's absolutely a beautiful reflection, and it made, as you were talking about it, it made me think. One of the people who I think has influenced me as a preacher is Doug Gay, and he did a little book, God Be in My Mouth, which is just, I think, one of the best books about preaching I've ever come across, purely because he doesn't construct some massive system of how to preach. He just fires off little thoughts. And one of his little thoughts is, if you've got a passage of scripture that, for example, like the Isaiah, is just the most amazing poetry, maybe it invites us to do the sermon as a poem. That maybe in a sense, maybe we don't have to hugely unpack. Maybe what we do is we evoke something of what Isaiah is trying to evoke, which is, as these words are presumably first heard, what they're doing, which is what poetry, as you were talking, Gerald, one of the things poetry does, I think it kind of lodges in us in a different way to the way neat, argument or even the finest exegesis might. So I was just beginning to, think in my mind, is this a Sunday when even the form of the sermon actually gets dictated to by the text? Just a thought.
Yeah, funnily enough, that thought came into my mind, but not the thought that I would actually poetize the sermon, but whether I might just allow the Isaiah just to speak for itself and to work on how to set it into worship, maybe with pictures and music, and how to actually set it in there and just allow it to speak for itself. I don't know. Lithan.
Something that I read, somebody notices, and this is kind of going back to what you said, Phil, about hearing this in the time of exile, that a lot of the things that God is doing in the passage, he is doing. So it's not saying, look what God has done, but it's look what he's still doing. So it's in the present tense. So he brings down powerful rulers. He doesn't grow faint. His wisdom is unsearchable. And so it's not saying, think back to what God has done. It's about know now what God is doing.
Yeah. Ruth.
It was just a little follow on from the, if Isaiah is poetry, we could use poetry. I just wonder whether that's kind of one understanding, going back to the 1 Corinthians. I struggle a bit with Paul's integrity of, to the Jews I become a Jew, to the weak I become weak, whatever you want me to be, I can kind of fit in. But of course he does say all for the sake of the gospel. So maybe there is something about our readiness to be flexible enough to speak the good news to people in the way that's most going to mesh with where they are. And there are people who don't like kind of exegetical sermons, and maybe there are people who would respond to something that was really much more language that's much more beautiful and poetic, rather than kind of trying to explain. And it's not just about our preferences, but it's also recognizing that in the hearers there will be preferences. So we let Isaiah speak for itself and use Isaiah, but also perhaps think about who we're talking to, how do we become who they are, so that we can convey the good news, which kind of helped me a bit with Paul, because I was struggling. I really glossed over 1 Corinthians because I just thought, oh, it's Paul again doing that thing. So I repent in dust and ashes.
I thought we were just pretending that the 1 Corinthians passage wasn't there, but you mentioned it now, Ruth, and the cat's out of the bag. But we have one preacher to go with their thoughts about how they might take these readings forward. Listen, where were you thinking of going?
I might have gone with 1 Corinthians because I think it's probably something for a conversation or a Bible study, which in my church, that's kind of what happens sometimes. So the other week on Zoom, I had my beautifully prepared flow of what we were going to do, and I'd finished reading it and someone just leant forward and went, so what's that all about then? Why is it? I'm going, no, that whatever point he made, I thought, no, that was my finale. You've just blown that thing. Especially on Zoom where people can just interrupt you. It would be a good conversation to think, what does that mean for us? What does it mean to have integrity but also fit in where we are? I was kind of musing about, what does it mean to say I can be one outside the law? I don't know, we have masks at the moment anyway, but it's like being a gunslinger, isn't it? But that's probably not what Paul means. So I could do that. I'd love to do Isaiah, but we haven't talked much about Mark, so that's what I'll do instead. And I was struck by the timings in this story. So it all happens after they've been to the synagogue. So probably it's a Sabbath day thing. And quite often you get Jesus healing people on the Sabbath, which is a shock. But here he's doing Sabbath end, I think. It might still be, it depends when they're having their Sabbath meal. I guess if that's Friday night, then we're still in Sabbath, aren't we, where he's doing a lot of healings. But either way, you can look at it as lots of stories of Jesus heals lots of people, or you can think about even more restoration. So for Simon Peter's mother, I have often scoffed about the fact that she just healed so they can have their tea, because as soon as she's healed, up she pops to make the meal. But probably for her, in the culture of the time, one of the most important evenings of the week would be sharing the Sabbath meal together, where the women would be lighting where it was their thing. So while the men were out doing stuff in the synagogue, their part of the worship, and it's still very much worship, would be doing that. And she'd been cut off from that because she wasn't well. And so Jesus comes in and restores her into community. And actually, for all the people that he heals, we kind of, like, I always remember when it's like a leper or someone with a demon, that they're on the outskirts, or the woman who's been bleeding. But in the culture of the time, according to the law, many people, if they had something wrong with them, that meant they couldn't participate. So actually, Jesus healing all of these different people, it's not just about them getting better, It's about them being restored to society, restored to synagogue, restored to their way of life. And if we can't heal in the way that Jesus did, we can still think about how can we help to restore people into community. So who are those that are shut out, and how can we bring them back in? And it may be that will give as much healing as other things. So particularly now when we're much more aware of mental health issues, and a lot of that comes from isolation or damage that's been done to people in the past, and knowing love sounds trite, but it's not. Knowing love can really be a restorative thing for a person, or knowing that there are people there who it doesn't matter about your past, they're interested in who you are now and who God made you to be, I think is really important. And then of course there's Jesus' restoration as well. So after he's done all this work, he goes off for a while, not long enough probably, because they come and go, no, you need to do more. But I love the way at the end, let's just find where he goes, they go, everyone's looking for you, and he doesn't go, oh, just another 10 minutes please. He goes, right, let's go. And so he has what, even if their time doesn't feel like enough, it was enough for him to go, right, what's next, what needs to happen, because this is what I came for. So in order for him to do what he came for, he needs that time of restoration and peace. And I read a lovely thing from Mark Iaconelli, who said, talked about observing his wife when she was pregnant. So when you get quite big in pregnancy and you're still running around doing lots of things, it can sometimes feel like, oh, the baby's not doing anything. But when you lay down and rest, that's when the baby goes, party time, and they start wriggling around and moving. And Mark Iaconelli said, unless we regularly stop the activity and sit still for a moment, we often miss making contact with the life waiting to be born. We miss God's Spirit moving within and around us, and become available to receive that gift of love that God has been waiting to give us. So I think, there's something about, if we want to try and make 3 points, that Jesus restores people to community, that we can be called to restore people to community in our own way, but we also need to be filled and restored with God's love to be able to do that.
Ruth.
Just thank you. But I mean, the phrase, yes, I picked up the phrase "what I came to do" from Jesus, and had spent a little bit of time thinking, how would you encapsulate that? And from what you've said, I think mending broken lives, and the idea that's about healing, but also about restoration. So thank you for that. I find that concept, and that we too can be mended, and that we can be part of the mending. So yeah, that was really helpful. Thank you.
Just from memory, because I read this preparing for a different session that we ran and then never actually used it. So it's a memory. It's a close memory, I think. It may not be totally accurate, but I think I read that in Mark's Gospel there are something like 18 miracles, and 13 of them are healing miracles, and over a quarter of those involve demons and exorcisms of some sort. It is a big thing in Mark's Gospel, this whole healing thing. And you wouldn't think so sometimes, I think, to hear, certainly the way I preach, that was such a massive focus of what Jesus was up to, because they're healing, but that's because it's kind of almost like the last taboo in preaching. We can preach about sex now, that's fine, but healing, we suddenly hackles go up, don't they? And it is a touch paper issue. So I think we have to honestly deal with what's going on with that, what we believe about it, how we feel about that, and allow the congregation to have mixture of responses to it, because there are always going to be, you know, it's always going to raise personal stories when you talk about healing in church. There is always going to be someone there who has a tragic story to tell of somebody who was not healed, and the pain. There's no way of easily addressing this without exposing yourself to that in the congregation. So I think there's a pastoral response on the side of preaching this this healing stuff. With the restoration, that's a common place to go with this thing, and I think you've done that in a kind of in a deeper way than I've often heard it with them, about this restoring thing. I like that, rather than Jesus needed a quiet time, so we should all have a quiet time, is where it all goes. 'Cause I'm not at all convinced, reading about Jesus's quiet times, that they were quiet times in the way that we imagine them. If I have a quiet time, it usually involves an armchair and a cup of coffee and a comfortable room and some peace and quiet. Whereas Jesus's quiet times were often in the dark, in wilderness places, beyond the boundaries of the town, and they always remind me of the wrestling in the wilderness, and they always remind me as echoes of what we were told about him wrestling, and I think his quiet times were times of wrestling, and this was possibly one of them. Wrestling. I could stay here and I could spend my entire life here healing these people. They're never going to run out. That queue outside Simon's mother's door is never going to go away. And that must have been a temptation. I'm famous here. I can make a difference. I can heal these people. But he makes a startling decision instead to say, no, let's move on somewhere else, even though there's a queue. And that's why the disciples want him to go back, because people are already knocking on the door saying, well, come on, heal us, heal us. And Jesus, that's not why I'm here. This is why I'm here. And it's a singular focus for his ministry, but it must have involved an awful lot of wrestling. If I'm involved in a bit of ministry that seems to be vaguely successful, that people are interested in, I'm going there. Whatever it is, I don't care. I'm going there. Neil.
Yeah, it's interesting as you say that, because that then makes a nice link back to our dear friend Paul, doesn't it? Because in a sense, that's also what Paul is doing. Paul is traveling on with all the ambiguities that we might have about how Paul's, you know, how he paints what he's doing. But part of what he's doing is saying, actually, you know, at the heart of everything, there is the fact that God has come, and he's come in Jesus. And so I'm going to keep going, traveling on. So there is that, there's an interesting link there between, you know, the one who at one point was trying to wipe out Christianity, who himself gets encountered on the way and then keeps moving on. And Jesus saying, right, you know, this has been great. We've done good things here, but now it's the next place. And I wonder if maybe somewhere in that there is something for us to hold and to reflect on about, you know, how willing we are to be a people on the move. I mean, we use all sorts of language to talk about mission and evangelism and, you know, tabernacling and all sorts of things.
Walking the way.
But I suspect, I mean, you know, the reality is our roots in a place go very deep, and that's important too, because that allows us to do lots of things that are about context. But I guess there's an interesting balance to strike about, but where's the new thing, or where's the moving on thing, even in a church community that's inhabiting a building that they've been in since 1660, whatever. What, you know, how does that play a part?
Yeah, absolutely. Preachers, think on how you're going to handle that. Lithan.
I was just struck with what Neil said about kind of moving on and mission and being in the one place, where what Paul says might also encourage my favorite model of mission, which is to say to a church, don't start up your own knitting and crochet group and expect people to come. You need to go out and join the knitting and crochet group in your community. And in a sense, that's, that's his version of, to those in the knitting and crocheting group, I become a crocheter, or to those who go to the pub, I have a pint. And actually,
Yeah.
if we look at it like that, because if we just stay in our little enclave, then we're literally preaching to the converted, I'd hope. But actually, if we want to do mission, then it does mean going out and mixing with people and not sitting there po-faced, but wholeheartedly joining in, because that's where the conversations will happen.
You see, I think if Paul had done knitting and crochet, it would have softened his image in many people's minds.
He might have. He had a lot of time on his hands in prison, didn't he?
Made tents. I suppose he did know his way around fabric.
He could do not.
Okay, yeah, think on. I waited until the end of this first section. Just I wanted to be see what people had to say. But I'm afraid I do have some bad news to announce. The imagery in Isaiah talks about the eagle, and it's absolutely glorious imagery. And it may lead some preachers to go and have a look on the internet for eagle stuff, and they will almost inevitably discover this oft used idea in preaching that the mother eagle deliberately pushes its babies out of the nest, and then they fall down the side of the cliff, and then she catches them, and that's how they learn to fly. And I've heard this preached live, and it's preached all over the internet. This is how God works. He disturbs us and pushes us, and then he catches us when we fall. I'm afraid I have to announce that there are no eagles that do this at all. That's not how eagles learn to fly. So don't go there. You will inevitably get David Attenborough in your congregation who will destroy your whole thing. So don't go there. Eagles do not push their... But it does come from this description in the Bible about them disturbing the nest and catching them on their pinions. Bible sort of does seem to suggest that, but that's not what happens, I'm afraid. So yeah, eagle imagery, fine. Eagles throwing kids out of nests, not fine. Okay, doesn't work. There's plenty more to do in worship than preaching. It gives us an opportunity, maybe particularly this week when we've been talking about poetry and all sorts of other things, about how we approach these texts to communicate in different ways. Sorry, that's me. So Ruth, where have you gone this week with thinking about the rest of worship?
Well, I because I was thinking about awe and I was thinking about creation, I was wanting to do something to help people to feel a certain awe about creation. So I think visual imagery would be very helpful. I also wondered whether music would help, and the one that popped into my head was "Be Still for the Presence of the Lord," because that it has that "come bow before him now with reverence and fear." And I suddenly thought, oh, I've been singing that, and never has it bothered me. And that's because of the kind of the beauty of the music. It's always a very, it tends to be a first hymn of worship. It's a kind of, bringing us into the presence of God. And I love it. And I love what it kind of does to me. And so something about the way that music can bring you to a place where you're not focusing on the meaning of one word so much, you're getting the whole thing. So what I'd love to do is put together images and music together so that people can kind of sit and be enveloped by the wonder of creation. And sorry, I'm not going to share that with you because I haven't created that thing. Because hopefully somebody else would do it, because that's the sort of thing that takes me an awfully long time and isn't very good. Whereas I'm sure there are things out there, if I look in the right places, I might find something that is that I can use under copyright, of course. But it reminded me of in the Pope Francis's encyclical of Laudato Si, which is praise to you. It's his one about the environment, which was one of his better things, I think, so far. Very good. The Pope will be delighted that I do approve of his work. It's a sort of imprimatur, if you like. But there he says, you cannot care for what you do not first love. And his point is that in order to get people to care for creation, people have to love it. And so I think something that helps people to just sit and be enveloped by how wonderful creation is, with music to carry them along as well. And then I'm just going to share, nothing very exciting, but a prayer of the Iona community, which went back to the idea of God's identity and our identity, and the God of all time. So I won't read it all because I don't want to take up all that time. But it's a prayer from the Iona community. It's easy to find on the internet. It is copyright, so you must make sure you bear that in mind. But it's that God keeps us waiting, and we thank God for the waiting time. God keeps us looking, God of all space. Thank you for the looking time. You keep us loving, God, whose name is love. Thank you for the loving time. And just the last bit I love. And in all this, you keep us through hard questions with no easy answers, through failing where we hope to succeed, and making an impact when we felt useless, through the patience and the dreams and the love of others, and through Jesus Christ and his Spirit, you keep us. And I would almost certainly use that prayer at some point, because I think it brings together some of those thoughts about God as creator, us as created and also co-creating, and the God of all time and space. It's wonderful words.
I think what I've heard you saying, and Neil, perhaps all of us saying to some extent, is that we're hoping with these readings to bring together two things that are often held as opposites, sort of God's immanence and God's transcendence. And we're trying to say they're not two separate facets of God. They are who God is, both, all at the same time. And I think that kind of prayer is a really creative and powerful way of doing that. And I think that would really help. Neil, what have you dug out of your resources closet for this week?
Well, I'm quite nervous about one of them, Phil, because I also thought about images of the Earth from space. And I don't know, I suspect you're about to take us to an image of the Earth from space.
Not if you do.
Well, the one I was going to use was the one called the pale blue dot. Is that the one you were going to use?
I can delete that one, don't worry, you carry on.
Do I carry on?
I've got plenty.
So, oh, hang on a minute. I need to do the share screen thing before I get excited about it myself.
Yeah. Okay. We're all getting
Just
excited.
watch your excitement. That'd be nice.
There we go.
Oh,
wow.
So I've used this often in worship. This is the Voyager spacecraft, which was launched back in the 70s to do the grand tour and gave us our first amazing pictures of Saturn and Jupiter and so on. Kept going. It has kept going ever since. Remarkably, we're still in touch with it. We can send it signals, we can receive from it. And it's become the first object that humanity has made that has left the solar system. So it has recorded the fact that it can no longer detect any influence of the sun. So it is, billions of miles away, traveling at an amazing speed. But there was a wonderful cosmologist in America called Carl Sagan that some of us would have remembered. And he spent a while with NASA saying, this spacecraft now has the opportunity to do something that we have never been able to do. It has the opportunity to look backwards at where it has come from and take a photo of the Earth from the furthest we can be. And so they argued about it, and then they found a way to do it. They programmed it, which in itself is kind of remarkable. They told it to turn around and to look backwards and to take a series of photographs. And this one has become, I think, famous as the pale blue dot. And what you're looking at, the band that you can see running top to bottom, and this is freely available if you just Google pale blue dot. The band is actually it's a bit of a sunbeam that is caught, because of course the camera is looking back towards the sun, which is not a good thing to do with the camera. And so they've got a bit of sunlight there, but in the midst of that sunlight, there is this dot of blue, which actually is smaller on the image than 1 pixel. And that is the Earth. So that is, and if you pursue it on Google, you'll find a rather amazing speech that Carl Sagan gave when this photo was released. And it's a very moving speech, because he talks about how, every army that has ever marched, every emperor who has ever thought that he ruled the world, all of that, everything we know, the entire history of our planet, there it is. And maybe that connects. So I'm sure Phil will find us some other ones, but that's one I might use. But the other one that I found is a bit naughty, really, because it doesn't yet work for the lectionary readings that we're looking at, but it will do by the time we get to that Sunday. Because on Twitter, I was introduced to, if I can find it, I'd never heard of this. I don't know if you have. The Englewood Review of Books, Community, Mission, Imagination and Reconciliation. It's a rather amazing website. And what they have just invented is a lectionary of poetry. So poetry, ancient poetry and modern contemporary poetry, keyed into all the Sundays of the lectionary. Now, unfortunately, it is so new, they haven't yet got to the Sunday that we're going to be doing. So for example, if you go down, they're looking at this. So what they give you each time, they give you a classic poem that is out of copyright, which is rather significant for putting it into worship and going online with it. So here you get a bit of George Herbert, and they make the point, public domain. And then they also give you something contemporary from a living poet, which obviously would be in copyright. And if you wanted to use it in all sorts of ways, you'd have to get the right permission. Now, eventually this will catch up, because of course we're ahead of ourselves. This will catch up. But it might be an interesting one just to bookmark in your browser and be able to return to from time to time. Because I suspect what it's going to end up being, I hope, is like Text Week and other things, it'll become a searchable database of all the lectionary texts.
It's fabulous. Yeah, no, I've never come across that. Although the sheep lying bloated in the field with their wormy bellies is now an image that I'm going to carry through the week. Yeah, I was going to say the blue dot, but just as a quick response to what Neil has just shown us, I'm going to show you something on the interwebnet. I think this is the interwebnet here. Yes. Right. I don't need the sound. And it's but this is just a link to a film which is worth watching, but it's 30 minutes long, so I'm not going to show you it. But the opening is this quote. Once a photograph of the Earth taken from outside is available, a new idea as powerful as any in history will be let loose, said Fred Hoyle in 1948. But I was interested, and the film, this is the theme of the film, is called Overview, because there is a thing recognized amongst astronauts called the overview effect. First described by Frank White in 1987, it's the effect of looking back at the Earth from space, an experience that transforms astronauts' perspective of the planet and mankind's place upon it, linking very much in with what Ruth said. Common features of the experience are a feeling of awe for the planet, a profound understanding of the interconnection of all life, and a renewed sense of responsibility for taking care of the environment. And this film explores that with lots of astronauts who've done it, explaining how they felt exactly that. So maybe the answer to climate change is just to send everybody out a bit and to have a and then bring them back. We'll come back with this feeling of awe. And I think that's absolutely fascinating with that. To have a God's view of a God's eye view of the world should give us those things. But we have had access to that since long before the 1960s, because we have access to that through the Psalms and through Isaiah. We've had access to the God's eye view of the world, which should, as Christians, have already given us the overview effect, because we've already seen it. We've had access to it. So you can just look up overview film, and it's on Vimeo, and you can have a look at this. It's a 30-minute long job, but I was fascinated that that's an actual thing. It's a condition that astronauts have. Gerald, what have you dug out of your knapsack?
Yeah, well, you've given me some brilliant ideas for a service of worship on this theme. We are privileged at Emmanuel in that we have a few young people. So from time to time we have all age worship, and this would lend itself to a very creative time of worship. So perhaps writing your own poetry in just a few lines. And what we tend to do is we get youngsters together with the older folk in the congregation around tables, and they can share thoughts. And if the tiny ones can't write yet or express yet, they can draw something, and then we could put it all together in some sort of presentation, as I guess we've been doing during this period where we haven't been able to meet live. So getting people to be creative and take photographs, that sort of thing. Also, we have a wonderful space outside our church. Those that have been to Emmanuel will know, Ruth will know. This lends itself to perhaps spending some time during the worship period just outside and absorbing a little of what I often take for granted, and then coming in to celebrate together. It also, I suppose, lends itself to singing some of the great glorious hymns of the faith, something that I think we're all aching to do right now. It would be great to do that. For the children, I don't know if any of you have come across an organization called Out of the Ark. They write a lot of music for children, primary school age. I use a lot of them for assemblies that I take in the 4 or 5 primary schools that I used to take assemblies in. I'm not allowed to at the moment. And they put into words in a contemporary way, in a very contemporary way, some of the expressions of deep faith and awe that might be required for a service such as this. So that's pretty much where I'd be at.
Cool. I like the idea of going outside. until you said that, it just hadn't occurred to me that that was part of what our worship experience should be about. And yet, if we're thinking about space and the world around us, we absolutely should be outside. What came through my head when you said that was whether it would be possible to wangle something with maybe some of your young people, or maybe older people, in the dark on a clear night, and either bring in someone who knows what they're talking about, or you can get fantastic apps on phones now that you just point at the sky and it tells you the names of the stars. And I know a lot of people around here during lockdown were really opened up to watching the night sky and seeing satellites moving and knowing what they were called and stuff. You can do the same with ships on the sea, but it's not quite as exciting. But looking up at the sky, I think might be, that's possible, isn't it? Yeah. Obviously, you can't do it at 10:30 in the morning on a Sunday. It doesn't work. We have to break out of our mould and worship at 11:30 at night in the middle of Swindon. I don't know whether you've got dark skies in Swindon or not. There you go. Nathan, where were you going with ideas for the rest of worship this week?
What I might do with Isaiah, and I can't decide whether I do it with drums or not, is there's a thing you can do about drumming through a passage, particularly a psalm. So you do need to have lots of drums. Now, we meet in a school that they keep moving them around, but we've got, when we find them, we've got access to lots of drums. And the idea is that you get everyone comfortable with drumming first. You read through a passage together. You read through the passage on your own. Everyone's got a copy. And then you look at whichever line is speaking to you and work out what that rhythm would be. And gradually everyone starts to drum their rhythm. It takes a while for the British to get used to this idea, but once you're comfortable, and then at the end, kind of share how you're feeling about it. And that can be quite profound. I think this one actually works well doing that without the drums. So if you don't have access to drums, I think with Isaiah, just saying to everyone, we'll read it through together, read it through on your own. Which is the phrase that's really speaking to you? Have a think about that. Maybe then draw, write, paint, crochet, whatever you've got with you to express that again, and then share that together. I think that would be something to do. The other thing that I found with 1 Corinthians is I quite often look at some of the text week we've mentioned before, some of the resources for children, partly because we do have children, but even if it's a Sunday where we don't have any, some of the things they use speak to people on a level that's really good. And one of the things on there is called Story Path. Now let's see if I can find. Okay. So each week you've got this thing called Story Path, and it has links to different books, children's books that go with the readings. And one they've mentioned for this week for the 1 Corinthians reading is one, it's a bit twee, called Kitten for a Day. And it's about a puppy who discovers a basket of 4 kittens and decides he wants to be friends with them. So he becomes a kitten for the day. And at the end of the day, they say, oh, let's be puppies tomorrow. And it kind of sums up quite well what Paul is trying to say, I think. And you can get, if you go onto YouTube, there's lots of films of people reading the book. So nowadays you don't even have to buy the book, although they are American accents. So it depends how you feel about that. You can either buy the book, which is better for the author, although he's died, but for his family, or you can have someone else reading it for you. And the Kitten for a Day is written by someone called Ezra Jack Keats, and he was a pioneer in American literature. And although that doesn't have any children in, even his first book, although he was a white Jewish New Yorker, his first book featured a black child, and that was in the 1960s, 70s, so it was quite new for that to happen. And he said it was important to have multicultural characters in books with loving parents, friends and pets because he wanted no child to be an outsider. And he said, if we could see each other exactly as the other is, this would be a different world. And I just love that idea that that's what books are about. And I'd probably talk a bit about him because he's quite inspiring, and then share that book.
Cool. I have to say, I am warming to the Apostle Paul now. All the knitty crocheter a kitten for the day is a lot more appealing to me. I've got stuff that probably doesn't come as much as a surprise, so I won't show you all of it, but I'll show you some of it. I might put the sound on as well, which is a mistake I've made in the past. There's this idea of immanence and transcendence and bigness and smallness and the God's eye view. This stuff is available. Probably the most famous one is this Cosmic Eye video, which you can find anywhere if you type in Cosmic Eye, which goes like this. Kind of goes on, and it goes way out. I quite like the way that it's got how far out it is as it goes along. Obviously, that's not a real camera. This is a reconstruction of what it might look like. And then at the end, it zooms back in again. So it comes back in and goes, if you like, the other way. So we're going back in. Get back to their eye. And this might be a bit creepy for some people. And it goes right into the heart of the cell and does the I'm just going wrong. It goes right up into the heart of the cell. And I just quite like the idea of the massive and the tiny view being an all-embracing understanding of who God is. God is outside the circle of the world, but God is also right in the heart of the molecules inside you. God is present. So yeah, that's about 3 minutes. Depends whether your congregation can watch for 3 minutes, but there's a video there.
And there's I mean, you've ended up with smiling face on our screen, which takes us back to Mark and Jesus kneeling at the bed with his mother-in-law. You know, that you can go right out, you can go right in, but God is also present in the smiling face. I find that quite profound.
I think that works as well, because the common point of beginning and ending is a real living, breathing, warm human person. Does she look like a mother-in-law? She might be.
One day.
What else have we got? If you were going with eagles, which I still might do a little bit of eagles, then there's plenty of videos. I think probably the best one I've found of camera footage of eagles flying, but with a camera on their back. This is what it's like to actually soar an eagle, which is the golden eagle soaring over Scotland. Take away the soundtrack of this, and you could add words of Isaiah, maybe, or you could put some music or poetry over the this image of a soaring eagle. The thing about eagles soaring is it's apparently effortless. We're not asked to soar like ducks, or it's of us soar like eagles, effortless, just taking the air currents. I could watch that quite a long time. Some people might be able to. That's an eagle soaring. That's what it actually looks like. And I'm a little bit surprised that nobody else has mentioned this. But if you wanted a different way of reading the Isaiah reading, then you could have Eric Liddell reading it from Chariots of Fire, which is also readily available on YouTube.
My text this afternoon is taken from Isaiah, chapter 40. Behold, the nations are as a drop in the bucket, and are counted as the small dust in the balance. All nations before him are as nothing. They are counted to him less than nothing. Vanity. He bringeth the princes to nothing. He maketh the judges of the earth as a vanity. Hast thou not known? Hast thou not heard that the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, fainteth not, neither is weary? Juvenile! No, sir. He giveth power to the faint, and to them that have no strength, he increaseth might. But they that wait upon the Lord.
Oh, I didn't mean to do that. Right. So, yeah, that's widely available, and I've watched it several times, and it always kind of gives me a tingle down the back. The way they've mixed in his tough journey, and he goes flying into puddles, and he's really wrestling with life and struggling, and what's it in the context of the whole film, and he's there in the pulpit reading that in his sort of that Scottish accent. It's just really powerful, I think. So if you wanted a different way of presenting the reading, that's an obvious way to do it.
And a nice bit of Vangelis in the background.
Oh yeah, you got to text.
Music gets you stirred up.
Yeah, add in some Vangelis, some poetry, some eagles, stir in a little bit of lunar photography, and I think we're pretty much there. Has anyone got any final thoughts about preaching or the rest of worship inspired by these Epiphany readings? Epiphany, of course, is still in a season of God being revealed, and this is the week where we talk about God being revealed in the cosmos and in the universe and in the world in which we live. It's an important task that we share. We hope that an hour or so of us talking absolute worship has helped you a little bit in your own preparation. It's an important task to which you and we are called. And so I'm going to ask Lithan if she will pray with us as we come to an end.
Oh God, we thank you that you've been with us as we've wrestled with your word and tried to break open what it means for us today. So be with us and all those who are preparing worship, that we might find the right words to say and things to do within worship to express your transcendence and your immanence, the way that you are awesome and mighty and present with us all the time. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.